You're standing in a corridor lined with rose-patterned tiles, the air thick with sandalwood and something you can't name. Something like fear dressed in silk. A hand grips your wrist. Not rough, but final. The man beside you wears emerald robes and speaks in a language you're only beginning to understand. He says one word, slowly, so you'll remember it forever. Chosen. And in that moment, you realize your old life, your name, your family, the village where you learned to read, has already become a ghost. What you're about to see unfolds in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, in chambers where beauty was currency and survival meant erasing yourself completely. This isn't a story about desire. It's about architecture, the careful construction of human beings into objects, into instruments, into secrets the empire would spend centuries trying to bury. Before we step through those doors, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It's still wild to me that a story hidden for so long in palace shadows can reach so many of us today, all searching for the same truth. Now, let's go inside. Constantinople, 1623. The palace of Topkapi sprawls across 7 hills like a city within a city, its courtyards guarded not just by soldiers but by silence, the kind that comes from everyone knowing what cannot be said aloud. Inside the 3rd courtyard, past the Gate of Felicity where even viziers must stop and wait for permission, there exists a world that no foreign ambassador will ever see firsthand. A world documented in palace ledgers with the same bureaucratic precision used to record grain shipments and tax revenues. Except these ledgers aren't cataloging wheat or silver. They're cataloging boys. The records are meticulous. Age, 12 to 16. Origin, Circassia, Georgia, the Balkans. Hair, dark, light, copper-toned. Eyes, green preferred, but brown acceptable if other qualities compensate. Skills, literacy in Greek or Slavic languages, musical aptitude, evidence of quick learning. Price, anywhere from 50 to 500 gold ducats, depending on a calculus that mixed aesthetics with availability. Beauty with the cold mathematics of supply and demand. These weren't children being adopted. They weren't students entering a school. They were entering an institution that had no exact parallel in Europe, a system so layered, so deliberately constructed, that even the Ottoman elite who participated in it used euphemisms to describe what actually happened behind closed doors. The word page appears in diplomatic correspondence. So does companion and attendant. But the palace's internal documents, written in coded Ottoman Turkish by scribes who knew their records might someday be scrutinized, are more direct. Güzeller, the beautiful ones. Maşuks, beloveds, and sometimes in margins where honesty crept through, malar, property. Here's what the European envoys didn't understand, or chose not to. Ottoman sexuality wasn't organized around the gender binary that defined Christian Europe. It was organized around power. The crucial distinction wasn't man and woman. It was penetrator and penetrated, active and passive, subject and object. A grown man could take a younger male as a lover and lose no status. In fact, the beauty and cultivation of his companion could enhance his reputation, display his wealth and taste like owning a rare manuscript or a perfect Arabian stallion. But the boy himself occupied a different universe entirely. He was the possessed, not the possessor. His role was to be gazed upon, desired, shaped, and eventually discarded when time and biology made him less pleasing to imperial aesthetics. The selection process began in distant provinces, in villages where Ottoman officials appeared with unsettling regularity during tax collection seasons. A certain kind of boy would catch their attention, something in the face, the bearing, the way light fell across a cheekbone. Sometimes families were compensated generously. Sometimes they received nothing but the understanding that refusal wasn't truly an option. The boys traveled to Constantinople in caravans, grouped with other tribute, a word the empire used deliberately. conflating human beings with grain, horses, and gold, all resources flowing toward the center of power. Upon arrival, they entered a transformation machine that operated with industrial efficiency. First came the renaming: Mehmed, Ahmed, Suleiman, Islamic names that severed them from their Christian or pagan origins. Then the circumcision, a physical marking that made their conversion permanent and their bodies legible within Islamic frameworks. Then the baths, the clothing, the first lessons in Turkish and Arabic. And then, for those selected for the inner tiers of service, something else. Training that no document describes explicitly, but that every contemporary observer acknowledged through careful silence. They learned to move differently, to speak in modulated tones that never grated or demanded, to read the micro-expressions of powerful men, a tightening around the eyes that meant displeasure, a certain quality of stillness that meant boredom, the almost imperceptible relaxation that meant approval. They studied poetry, particularly the Persian ghazals that celebrated the beauty of adolescent boys in language so refined it could be recited in court without causing scandal. They learned music, because a boy who could play the ney flute or sing a maqam while candlelight played across his features became an aesthetic experience, not just a body. But here's the architecture of control that textbooks miss. They were taught to want this. The palace created elaborate reward systems where compliance brought luxury, status, access to power. A boy who pleased his patron might receive gifts, jeweled daggers, fine horses, even property. He might be given command over other servants, allowing him to wield power even as he remained subject to it. The most successful could become intermediaries, translating their patrons' desires to the outside world, accumulating influence that outlasted their physical appeal. The system didn't just exploit them, it made them complicit. It transformed victims into perpetrators, ensuring the machine would feed itself across generations. Sultan Murad IV kept a boy named Ibrahim in his private chambers for 3 years. The records mention Ibrahim exactly twice, once when he arrived from Tbilisi at age 14, and once when he died at 17 from what the palace physician described as a fever of the blood. The space between those entries tells a story the scribes couldn't write. 3 years. 3 years of existing at the absolute center of Ottoman power, in rooms where the Sultan decided which cities would burn and which nobles would live to see morning. 3 years of being seen, desired, possessed by a man who controlled an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad. And then, erasure. A single line in a ledger, a body wrapped in silk and buried in an unmarked grave, and the system moving on to the next beautiful face. The horror isn't just in the exploitation, it's in the sophistication. The empire had engineered a form of bondage that didn't require chains because it colonized desire itself. Boys competed with each other for favor, creating hierarchies among the enslaved that mirrored the hierarchies of the free. They informed on each other, sabotaged rivals, formed temporary alliances that dissolved the moment circumstances changed. Trust became impossible when your closest friend might betray you for the chance to spend one more night in the Sultan's presence before age made him irrelevant. And age always came. By 20, sometimes earlier, the bloom faded. The boy who'd been showered with attention found himself transferred to lesser nobles, then to provincial governors, descending through ranks of wealth and power like a coin losing its shine. Some became supervisors of new arrivals, teaching the next generation the same techniques of psychological survival they'd mastered. Others were given administrative positions where their knowledge of palace politics proved useful even after their bodies no longer pleased. The lucky ones found patrons who valued companionship over appearance, men who kept them in comfort as they aged into their 30s and 40s. But many simply vanished. The ledgers that tracked their arrival rarely noted their departure. They appear as acquisitions, assets purchased and maintained, but the accounting of their disposal is scattered, vague, lost to fires and revolutions and the deliberate destruction of embarrassing records. What happened to a 25-year-old former favorite with no family, no profession, no identity beyond the role he'd been trained to perform. Some scraps of evidence suggest answers. A spike in begging around palace gates, reports of former pages working as bathhouse attendants, occasional suicides that scandalized neighborhoods because the deceased were found dressed in expensive clothing that didn't match their obvious poverty. Here's what survived in the archives of the Topkapi Palace Museum, an inventory from 1648 listing 43 icholan, inner boys, between ages 12 and 19. Next to each name, a notation of special assignments that the scribes didn't elaborate on but that corresponded with specific chambers in the palace's most restricted zones. The inventory includes detailed descriptions of each boy's appearance, their training progress, and their value retention, a phrase that meant how many more years they'd remain aesthetically viable. It's dated and signed by the Kusler Ase, the chief black eunuch, who administered the system with the same efficiency he brought to managing the empire's female concubines. Reading that document is like watching someone describe a garden while you slowly realize they're actually cataloging prisoners. The palace eunuchs themselves occupied a strange adjacent space in this system. Castrated before puberty, they could move between male and female quarters, trusted because their bodies supposedly eliminated desire from the equation. But trust isn't the right word. They were administrators of intimacy, managers of human inventory, and many had themselves been boys in the system before their castration marked them for different service. Some archives suggest they were the cruelest supervisors, their own trauma transmuted into zealous enforcement of the rules that had destroyed them. One eunuch, Suleiman Ah, left a memoir that circulated in manuscript form before being suppressed in the 19th century. Only fragments survived, but they're devastating in their casualness. The new boys from Bosnia arrived Thursday. 3 were selected for immediate training. 2 were reassigned to the stables when their measurements proved disappointing. 1 tried to escape the first night and was made an example, though the details are not suitable for recording here. He writes like a factory foreman reporting on production issues. The human terror beneath his words appears only in what he refuses to describe. European travelers occasionally glimpsed edges of this world and struggled to process what they were seeing. In 1630, a Venetian ambassador named Alvise Contarini wrote to the Doge describing a palace ceremony where he observed youths of extraordinary beauty, dressed in cloth of gold, serving the Sultan with such elaborate deference that I was reminded of religious supplicants approaching an altar. He noted their ages, 14, perhaps 16, and the way they moved, as though each gesture had been rehearsed 1,000 times. He wondered in his report whether these were the Sultan's sons. A diplomatic colleague corrected him quietly, and Contarini never mentioned them again in his official correspondence. But in his private diary, discovered centuries later in a Venetian library, he wrote, "I have seen boys made into something else entirely. I cannot describe it to the Senate. I am not certain I have language for what I witnessed. The Ottoman elite themselves created elaborate cultural frameworks to justify and aestheticize these practices. Poetry celebrated the mahbub, the beloved boy, in metaphors borrowed from Persian classical literature, cypress trees, moons, gazelles, flames that consumed the lover. Sufi mystics wrote treatises arguing that loving a beautiful boy was a path to understanding divine beauty, the earthly beloved merely a stepping stone toward celestial truth. These weren't fringe ideas. They circulated in the highest intellectual circles, providing philosophical cover for practices that violated the very Islamic law the empire claimed to uphold. Because here's the contradiction that tore through Ottoman jurisprudence. Islamic law explicitly forbade liwat, sexual relations between males, with punishments that ranged from public humiliation to death. Yet the practice flourished in the palace, among the ulama, across military ranks. The solution was a kind of collective doublethink. The law existed. Everyone knew it existed. And everyone with sufficient status operated as though they lived in a separate reality where the law applied to common people, but not to them. Judges who would sentence a shopkeeper to lashes for sodomy would attend evening gatherings where teenage boys served wine and sat in their patrons' laps. The hypocrisy wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system, a demonstration that power meant transcending the rules that governed others. What happened to boys who resisted? Records are scarce, but telling. In 1671, a 17-year-old page named Hassan tried to escape the palace disguised as a servant. He was caught and later exiled to Anatolia, a warning to others. Some resisted by becoming flawlessly obedient, erasing their identities to survive. Others sought patrons who valued intellect over beauty, or used their earnings to buy new lives as merchants or scribes. Most simply endured until the system discarded them. Trained only to please, they entered a world with no place for them. Some became servants. Others vanished into the empire's shadows. One survivor, Davoud, wrote in 1702, "You ask if I regret it. I do not understand the question. I was never given a choice. I was given this life, and I learned to survive it." The system began to crack not from moral awakening, but from political pressure. As the empire weakened in the 18th and 19th centuries, reformers trying to modernize Ottoman institutions found themselves embarrassed by practices that European powers used as evidence of Islamic backwardness. The Tanzimat reforms of the 1830s and 1840s officially abolished many palace customs, including the Icholan system. Boys were no longer to be collected as tribute. The palace schools were restructured along European lines. Official documents stopped using the old euphemisms. But systems this deeply embedded don't vanish because of legislation. They metastasize. The practices moved out of the palace and into private houses, became less formal but no less real. Wealthy Ottoman families still acquired young boys as servants, still formed the same kinds of relationships, still operated under the same power dynamics, just without official sanction or bureaucratic recording. The end of the system wasn't its abolition. It was its dispersal into spaces where historians can no longer easily trace it. And then came the final erasure, historical revision. As the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the Turkish Republic emerged, nationalist historians began scrubbing the records. Documents were destroyed. Archives were closed. Alternative narratives were created that portrayed the palace pages as students in an elite academy, ignoring or minimizing the sexual dimensions of their service. European Orientalist stereotypes about Turkish depravity were countered by Turkish counter-narratives about Western misunderstanding and prejudice. The truth, that this was a systematic institution of sexual exploitation operating for centuries with state sanction, became politically inconvenient for everyone, and so it slipped into the gap between competing mythologies. What remains today are fragments. The palace ledgers that survived fires and revolutions, the occasional memoir or letter that escaped censorship, the travelers' accounts with their mixture of fascination and incomprehension. Archaeological evidence from palace structures, the privy chamber with its elaborate surveillance architecture, the Has Oda, where the Sultan's most intimate servants slept, the carefully designed spaces that enforced hierarchy and control through their very layout. And, perhaps most revealing, the silences, the places where records should exist but don't, the documents that were clearly removed from their bindings, the genealogies with missing generations. The absence itself is a kind of evidence. There's a room in the Topkapi Palace that tourists walk through quickly, usually on their way to see the imperial treasury or the harem. It's called the Chamber of Petitions, decorated with Iznik tiles and patterns that seem to shift depending on the angle of light. In the 17th century, this was where the Sultan received his favorite pages for private audiences. The acoustics are strange. You can whisper in one corner and be heard clearly in another, a design feature that allowed eavesdropping, surveillance, the monitoring of conversations that were supposed to be intimate. Stand there now, in the silence between tour groups, and you can almost feel the weight of all those disappeared lives. Boys who were renamed, reshaped, used until they were no longer useful, and then erased so thoroughly that even the manner of their erasing was erased. The empire that built this room wanted to be remembered for its military conquests, its architectural achievements, its contributions to art and science. And it is. But beneath that glory, encoded in the architecture itself, is another story. A story about how power doesn't just control bodies, it colonizes souls, rewrites desire, makes victims complicit in their own destruction. The tiles on the walls are still beautiful. That's perhaps the most disturbing thing. Beauty was the weapon. Beauty was the cage. And centuries later, we stand in that cage admiring its craftsmanship, while the ghosts of everyone who was broken here remain unnamed, uncounted, their suffering sublimated into the aesthetic glory of an empire that turned human beings into art objects and called it civilization.